Thanks to Stefan Grundmann for this very kind introduction, and thanks to you for having me here. I could also say you made me do my homework. Because roughly 3 years ago, Armin von Bogdandy, the director of the Max Planck Institute for International and Foreign Public Law, asked me to write an article on taxation and democracy, but I never got anywhere. So when Stefan Grundmann and Richard Bellamy said I should give a talk here, which might be of interest not only for lawyers, but also for economists or political scientists or historians, I said, now or never. I write that article on taxation and democracy. I will present it here. I hope to get a lot of critical reactions from your side, and that will improve the final version, which is meant to be published in Der Staat, which is a public law journal. But from time to time, being a private lawyer myself, I like to do that sort of public law as well. Taxation and democracy. No taxation without representation. This world-famous battle cry, stemming from the American War of Independence against British oppression, springs to mind immediately when we start thinking about the relationship between taxation and democracy. Taxation being the most prominent and most extensive intrusion of the state's power into the sphere of the individual, shall be legitimized by the people's consent. To phrase it differently, the mandatory character of the tax shall be mitigated by the voluntary dimension of parliamentary representation. Similar demands have been raised in manifold historical situations: the agreement on the Magna Carta, the enactment of the Bill of Rights, the Convention of the États Généraux in 1789. One can say, that's what I tell my student in the first class in tax law, that world history turns around taxation and democracy. Today, the link between democratic decision-making and the fiscal powers of the state is taken for granted and enshrined in most constitutions of the world. In the United States, only Congress has the power to introduce federal taxes. More specifically, the time-honored origination clause of the American Constitution provides that, and I quote, all bills for raising revenue shall originate in the House of Representatives. Since 1787, neither the President nor the US Senate have been entitled to initiate the legislative process in order to wrest legislative power in fiscal matters with the institution closest to the American people. 2 years later, in 1789, the French Declaration of Human and Civil Rights established the rule that chaque citoyen a le droit, par lui-même ou par ses représentants, de constater la nécessité de la contribution publique, de la consentir librement, d'en suivre l'emploi et d'en déterminer la quantité, l'assiette, le recouvrement et la durée. The 19th and the 20th century have seen the rise of nearly uniform constitutional language around the world, confirming the people's ultimate power in the area of taxation. In a paradigmatic fashion, Article 127 of the Swiss Constitution provides that the design of taxes, in particular the definition of taxable persons, the object of the tax, and the measurement of the tax base, has to be set by the legislator itself, at least with regard to its main features. Similar language you even find now following a 2015 amendment in China's constitution. This constitutional framework seems to support the view that the interaction between taxation and democracy is in good order. People are allowed to vote in elections. Elected representatives will implement the will of the people when it comes to levying taxes and when it comes to the expenditure of the revenue raised by these taxes. People will enjoy the benefits from public goods and redistributive measures as agreed upon in the democratic process. Yet, this apparent untroubled picture is subject to serious challenges. These challenges result from the fact that the underlying framework of taxation and democratic communities is less solid than one might think. The argument runs as follows. Political economy tells us that the starting point for any healthy relationship between taxation and democracy is the congruence or equivalence as regards the people who vote on the tax, the people who pay the tax, and the people who benefit from the tax. In any simple model, this will be true for the community in question as an aggregate. But for the individual taxpayer, this, within any given community, this relationship will typically not hold. Due to the fact that taxation is not a simple quid pro quo for an individual benefit, like a user's fee or a social security contribution, asymmetric effects will be not the exception but the rule. Some taxpayers will win, others will lose. Public goods will be enjoyed with different intensity by the members of the community. Redistribution, by its very definition, reallocates wealth between citizens. Thus, any tax which might conceptually be labeled a voluntary transfer at the aggregate level can be characterized as a mandatory taking at the individual level. This leads to the question whether the individual taxpayer has to accept any burden imposed on him on the basis of democratic procedures, financing public goods he's perhaps not interested in, or implementing redistributive measures to his detriment. The situation becomes even more difficult when we relax the assumption that there exists congruence between voters, taxpayers, and beneficiaries. Take income taxation. Voting rights are regularly linked to citizenship, but taxability goes far beyond citizenship and hits both foreign nationals who are resident in the taxing jurisdiction as regard their worldwide income, and also foreign residents doing business in the jurisdictions as regards their local income. Is there a justification for taxation of non-voters in the first place? Surely this cannot be built on democratic consensus in a formal sense. Maybe the voluntary act of taking residence in a country or doing business in a country counts as a substitute for a formal vote. On the other hand, most countries do not tax their own nationals when these live abroad, the mavericks being the United States and Eritrea, who cannot get their hands off citizenship taxation. Last but not least, the relevant communities of voters, taxpayers, and beneficiaries do not remain stable. Taxpayers may leave a country and move to another tax jurisdiction. This can result in a shift of public revenue between these countries. Tax competition will evolve and put pressure on local policymakers. There's a lot of political and scholarly debate on the claim that today's democratic decision-making in tax matters gets distorted by influential outsiders, in particular multinational companies, but also by wealthy individuals. The widely used parlance of citizens and companies, and I quote, voting with their feet, points directly to the impact of cross-border movements on the democratic process. The discussion of the theoretical model, congruence of voters, taxpayers, and beneficiaries, shows that democracy and taxation do not align as easily as the household rhyme of taxation and representation suggests. There are conflicts which from a normative point of view might need to be addressed by constitutional constraints and democratic procedures. Some constitutions and constitutional court practice, most notably in Germany, Switzerland, and other countries of continental Europe, but also in Latin America, have established such constraints with varying success. While in other countries, most notably in the United Kingdom, but also to a large extent in the United States, the citizens simply put their trust in the political process. Against this background, this lecture is devoted to the constitutional options to diminish distortions and to moderate conflicts arising from the fact that taxation is, after all, a statutory obligation on individual persons to effect a mandatory payment for which they cannot expect any individual consideration. So let's start with the first topic, how to protect the individual in the tax world. A closer look at the historical and theoretical development of taxation in modern times reveals one decisive feature up front. You can think of taxation from the top to the bottom, taking the state and its fiscal needs as a given and trying to formulate material principles guiding fiscal policies, thus establishing a substantive framework for taxpayer protection. This is what I call taxpayer protection by content. You can also think of taxation from the bottom to the top, requiring the involvement of citizens at all stages, making the mere existence of taxation dependent on democratic procedures and voluntary acts by the citizenry. This is what I call taxpayer protection by consent. Without claiming to be comprehensive, it is fair to say that we can relate both concepts to two leading political philosophers of 17th century England, Thomas Hobbes and John Locke. Hobbes' work is archetypical for protection by content, while Locke's theory of taxation is systematically built on taxpayer consent. We can then, with a huge grain of salt, draw a line through some centuries of tax policy leading to today's constitutional conflicts. First, protection by content, the evolution of tax principles. In Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan, the state is not a democratic state. It may be built on some mythical social contract, but it does not require ongoing legislation, not even confirmation by a representative legislature to exercise its power. The monarch's sovereignty is absolute and the people have to obey. Taxes are levied without any voluntary decision-making on the side of the taxpayer. If one accepts the fundamental necessity to establish a government to secure internal and external peace, it follows logically that one also accepts the fundamental necessity to provide funds for the sovereign power, and this justifies taxation without consent. But the sovereign power in Hobbes' world, though it is not constrained by democratic institutions, is constrained by the material requirement that justice be equally administered to all degrees of the people, that is, that as well the rich and mighty as poor and obscure persons, that's an original quote, may be righted of the injuries done to them. For in this consists equity, to which, as being a precept of the law of nature, a sovereign is as much subject as any of the meanest of his people. And this has consequences for taxation, and I quote again, to equal justice appertains also the equal imposition of taxes, the equality whereof depends not on the equality of riches, but on the equality of the debt that every man owes to the Commonwealth for his defense. Equality of taxation. This is a material standard tax lawyers know quite well and apply to this day. For Hobbes, this standard is built on equal justice, being part of natural law, and there has been a lot of debate by modern-day scholars what he means precisely insofar. We cannot go into detail here, but one should note that taxpayer protection on the basis of equality of taxpayers is regarded to be the starting point for a just tax system. Throughout the 18th century, the evolution of such material tax principle abounds. You find it with Vauban in France, you find it with Adam Smith in Scotland, and you find today in most constitutions of the world the principle of the equality of the taxpayer enshrined in very specific sometimes, but also in general formulations. The most prominent emanation of this principle of tax equality is the principle that tax should be paid according to ability to pay, a principle which is explicitly found, for example, in the Swiss constitution, in the Brazilian constitution, in the Spanish, in the Italian constitution, etc. It is fair to say that this battle of equality was fought in the first place against tax privilege. Tax privilege for the nobility and the church in the 18th century, tax privilege for the rich and the mighty. It went hand in hand with the introduction of the democratic process, but it is not the same. Conceptually, the principle of tax equality can be applied under any governmental form. It does not require democratic decision-making. This is different in the world of John Locke. As said before, a different line of thinking links the justification of taxation to the consent of the taxpayer. Enjoying good government and having good tax principles is not enough. Let me quote from John Locke's second treatise on government. It is true, he says, governments cannot be supported without great charge, and it is fit, everyone who enjoys his share of the protection should pay out of his estate his proportion for the maintenance of it. But still, it must be with his own consent. That is, the consent of the majority, giving it either by themselves or their representatives chosen by them. For if anyone shall claim power to lay and levy taxes on the people by his own authority, and without such consent of the people, he thereby invades the fundamental law of property and subverts the end of government. For what property have I in that which another may by right take when he pleases to himself? Reading Locke from the perspective of modern political economy, one is interested in the question why he so easily conflates individual consent by the taxpayer, who loses his property, and democratic consensus as afforded by the majority of voters. The reason may lie in the fact that for Locke, the conflict between minority and majority, which seems so salient today, could be assumed away to a large extent. Firstly, he was only willing to allocate voting rights to persons if and to the extent to which they actually pay taxes. In his view, a part of the people is only allowed to participate in legislation, and I quote, in proportion to the assistance which it affords to the public. In Locke's time, this greatly reduced the number of citizens entitled to participate in political decision-making. Basically, this was the landed gentry, which had concurring interest anyhow. It is very clear that the concept that voting rights shall be granted in proportion to the amount of tax paid by a citizen to the state carries major implications for policymaking, in particular for the level of redistribution, but also for the size of the public sector and the quantity and quality of public goods being provided by the state. Against this background, it comes as no surprise that the 19th century has seen a constant fight about the enlargement of the franchise, first from the landowning nobility to the urban bourgeoisie, and at a later stage from the capitalist businessmen to their employees. In De la Démocratie en Amérique, Alexis de Tocqueville strongly supported to limit voting rights to the middle classes who would look for parsimony and efficiency in public spending. John Stuart Mill even pleaded for a restriction of voting rights in fiscal matters to those who actually pay, and he wanted to take away electoral rights from those who live on public welfare. We have seen similar examples in Germany, where in Prussia the Dreiklassenwahlrecht allocated voting rights in proportion to the amount of taxes being paid. In our time, these concepts are widely ridiculed as an atavistic remnant from bygone days of feudalism and class struggle. Today, equal voting rights are accepted as self-evident results of social and moral assumptions about the equal value of human beings. But one should not overlook that this result stems from values rather than from logic. From the point of view of political economy, the idea to link consent to the amount of taxes paid had, and for some people still has, some value. Taking these issues seriously, the founding father of modern political economy and public choice, the Swedish scholar Knut Wicksell in 1896, pleaded for a supermajority requirement in all budgetary and fiscal matters. He proposed that no fiscally relevant action should be taken unless there was unanimous consent among the representatives of the different social constituencies. His work laid the conceptual foundations for the public choice approach championed since the 1960s by James Buchanan and his school. From our perspective, it's interesting to learn that Wicksell did not put much trust in any material principles of taxation, in particular not in the concept of equality of taxpayers. From his perspective, once a broad consensus has been framed within the population, the tax burden could take any form, any arbitrary form, as long as great consensus, large consensus, was found among the citizenry. 20th century history has seen different attempts to establish sophisticated models of consent-oriented rules for taxpayer protection. The famous Proposition 13 of the Californian tax revolution in 1978 created the requirement of a supermajority for the introduction of new taxes in California, and that's why California, being a rich state, is nearly always close to being broke. Hayek proposed the division of competence between an upper house responsible for defining the tax base and a lower house setting the tax rate and the budget on an annual basis. And in Germany, the simple fact that all major tax legislation has to be agreed upon both by the Bundestag and the Bundesrat as being the representation of the Länder has done more to protect the taxpayers than any constitutional judgment. The obligation to pay tax, and this is the main difference between the Hobbesian and the Lockean approach to taxation, arises either from the mere fact that the taxpayer is a subject of the state, irrespective of the government form in place, or it builds on the individual consent given by the taxpayer or his group of peers on a voluntary basis. What happens if one tries to embrace both views simultaneously? The resulting conflict became topical in the 19th century. Its contrasting theoretical solutions can be found in the writing of two leading public intellectuals of the 19th century, John Stuart Mill in England and Friedrich Julius Stahl in Germany. In his Principle of Political Economy of 1848, starting out from a rather Hobbesian approach, Mill emphasized the general but equal obligations of citizens towards their state. Their contribution should not reflect any benefit received, but an equal sacrifice towards the common good. In a similar vein, and only 2 years earlier, Friedrich Julius Stahl expressed the view when he laid out that being a subject of the state as such justifies in full being subject to taxation. The very essence of the state leads consequentially to taxation, not, as he wrote, as a quasi-contractual consideration, but as an obligation arising from the individual's membership in the nation. How does this relate to the fact that both Mill and Stahl accepted the existence of parliamentary powers in fiscal matters? In order to align the conflict between the widely accepted notion that the state as such deserves to be financed by its own citizens and the interest of the citizens to get involved in the decision-making, John Stuart Mill allocates to the executive the power to shape the fiscal affairs of the state in the first place. It's up to the King of England to deliver the first shot. Parliament, on the other side, is reduced to a mere veto power. For Stahl, who sought to preserve the Prussian monarch's prerogative, even the notion of a parliamentary veto right endangered the stability of the state as such. When speaking in the Prussian First Chamber in 1849, he fervently dismissed the proposal that Parliament should have the power to reject the King's annual budget altogether. A Parliament-driven government shutdown, to borrow from modern parlance, would not only jeopardize central functions of the state, it would lead to what he called democratism, which was bound to destroy the finely tuned separation and balance of powers within the state. For Stahl, parliamentary powers in the field of taxation only enabled the people's representatives to have a word on incremental increases of the annual tax revenue, but not to force their will on other branches of the government. For writers like Hobbes, Mill, or Stahl, the obligation to pay taxes is primarily built on the taxpayer being a subject of the state. The answer to the question of whom this state represents and who's in charge of government is of a secondary nature and has changed over time. Since the French Revolution, the people as such, in German parlance the Staatsvolk, have taken over as the source of legitimacy for the exercise of the state's powers. In the end, the monarch or any ruling elite gave way to the entirety of the citizens. This replacement of the monarch by the people, which we witness throughout the 19th and the 20th century, lends to the interaction between taxation and democracy a specific twist. Following Montesquieu's and Rousseau's dialectic view of the members of a nation being both the objects of the state's powers and the subjects of government, the taxpayer sees himself in both camps. being part of the taxing power and being subject to its execution. At first glance, this dialectic perspective makes us believe that the age-old contrast between the Hobbesian and the Lockean view goes away once full democratic government has arrived. Under the new rules, no taxation will be effected which is not built on the consensus of the people. Taking a closer look, it turns out that the replacement of autocratic government by democratic government does not change the nature of the problem at all. Georg Jelinek, one of Germany's most acute constitutional lawyers at the turn of the 20th century, clarified that the fiscal decision taken by the people, acting as a homogeneous organ of the state in the sense of Rousseau, have no conceptual relationship to the individual consent of a taxpayer or his peer group required in the Lockean world. Once we switch from the bottom-up perspective of individual consent to the top-down perspective of a government run by the majority, the problems are there. And this brings up the underlying paradox. People are subject to a majority decision which they have not voted for but which they have to accept as being their own. It is quite telling that a political philosopher who grew up in France but was exposed to democracy in America, Tocqueville, became the most prominent critic of the tyranny of the majority in democratic systems. In his view, the majority of voters lacking any personal financial means and taxing capacity would only plead for large-scale redistribution, but also for a major increase in public spending on the whole. Today, in political and constitutional discourse, the focus which has been on the state by philosophers like Hobbes, Mill, or Stahl has moved to concepts of community and solidarity. The citizenry of the state is regarded as a social union, an organism whose members are expected to show responsibility for each other and who are willing to sacrifice their personal wealth to a limited extent for the general good. This social model of the state and of society is particularly important in the context of redistribution as a major goal of taxation. The concept started with Rousseau's Discourse in 1751, where he pleaded for a tax-free threshold for the poor in order to allow for their basic needs and a progressive tax system for the rich. This notion gained ground in the 19th century on the basis that the state and its functions are strongly related to the nation as a rather homogeneous and coherent social entity. 19th century social philosophers, including Karl Marx, happily joined the bandwagon and pressed for high progressive taxes as a means of class struggle. But also German mainstream thinking, famous theorist Adolf Wagner laid out that the state represents the highest form of human coexistence, the highest form of a compulsory community as opposed to what he called a Smithian perception of the state. There is no room in this lecture to develop an overarching concept of solidarity in a constitutional, philosophical, or sociological sense. In the context of taxation, the biggest conceptual problem stems from the fundamental necessity to define the composition and to delineate the outer borders of the community towards which a taxpayer owes solidarity. Both major goals of taxation, provision of public goods and redistribution of wealth, require the definition of a limited group of persons who shall enjoy the public goods financed by the tax and among whose members' wealth shall be reallocated by the tax. History has seen manifold social groups, large and small, which have claimed solidarity from its members. One could mention families, local municipalities, religious groups, social classes, ethnic communities, but also the nation as a whole. Today's modern societies have grown skeptical as regards such historical justifications, cultural foundations, or even ethnic or racial connotations of solidarity. This leads us to the rather minimalistic question of whether the simple fact of being a citizen of a state leads to fundamental obligations of solidarity towards all other citizens of the same state. Many constitutions stress that solidarity, starting with the French constitutions of the revolutionary age and ending with the current constitution of the People's Republic of China. But it is unclear to what extent this notion of solidarity goes beyond the common interest in maintaining a smoothly functioning government and the self-evident rule that citizens have to obey the laws issued by the democratically elected legislature. To what extent does this situation require additional constitutional constraints to democratic tax legislation? The English approach traditionally rejects the notion of hardwired substantive limitations to parliamentary legislation in the area of taxation. Nevertheless, the 19th century saw a strong current among tax experts that some general principles of taxation formed part of unwritten compulsory constitutional elements in fiscal affairs. As historian Chantal Stebbings has shown, the growing impact in the 19th century England of central government's power in the area of tax administration was heavily criticized by contemporaries. In particular, the introduction of inquisitorial procedures and the shift of tax collections to central government authorities were regarded to be unconstitutional. The main argument, and that is interesting, of English critics at the time was that the powers of central government were not covered by the real consent, by the true consent of the taxpayer. And this argument ran into the problem that it insinuated a double meaning for the word consent. The approval of the government's action by the majority of members of parliament would, that was the public opinion at the time, not be sufficient to substitute for real consent by individual taxpayers. But this double notion of consent did not meet with much favor, as the paramount sovereignty of Parliament had been widely accepted at this point in time. Moreover, given that there is no written constitution under English law, it was hard to transform the constitutional resentment of the taxpayers against modern intrusion of the taxing state into hardwired obstacles to legislation. Taking a closer look, one cannot help but state that the institutional framework in the United Kingdom adheres to a Lockean word, to the counterfactual fiction that Parliament is not identical and not synchronized with the government, and that it is the foremost obligation of Parliament to protect the interest of citizens vis-à-vis the Queen and her government. This Lockean theory of the Parliament's role has been enshrined in some strangely outdated customs, like the introductory preamble to the Annual Finance Act, which clarifies the mere voluntary character of taxation. Moreover, some major taxes, like the income tax, have to be formally reconfirmed under the Annual Finance Act for the upcoming fiscal years. Otherwise, they might simply expire. But these traditional language cannot conceal the political fact that the British Parliament has the power to set its own political agenda and to pursue it full force. But maybe it explains why we do not have any meaningful discussion in the United Kingdom on constitutional constraints on tax legislation. A special case is the United States. Here we find, on the one hand, a strong and deep attitude towards the principle of democracy, but still a great deference to the political decisions taken by Congress in tax matters. Lord Justice Marshall's famous dictum that power to tax is the power to destroy might have been mitigated in later findings, in particular by Oliver Wendell Holmes, but the US Supreme Court has never developed strong material limitations to tax legislation. The most prominent hardwired constraint to federal legislation stems from the division of fiscal competences between the states and the federation, which the Supreme Court has employed to limit federal taxing powers on many occasions. To give a prominent example, at the end of the 19th century, the Supreme Court declared a federal progressive income tax unconstitutional for competence reasons, And to give a more recent example, the current Chief Justice John Roberts saved Obamacare in 2015 by declaring mandatory payments under the Obamacare Act to be a legitimate federal tax in the first place. Overall, one gets the impression that similar to the institutional setup in the United Kingdom, under the US Constitution, Congress regards itself not to be part of the government, but rather a representative body defending the taxpayer vis-à-vis the president and the whole executive branch. This makes the political process, but also US-specific instruments, like a government shutdown, much more important than substantive limitations to the state's power to tax its citizens. German constitutional thinking, and that's also true for most of the other continental European countries, does not start from the assumption that the fiscal powers of the Bundestag act as a shield against the executive branch's fiscal outreach. Rather, the Bundestag is in full control of the government, the Chancellor and the Cabinet being responsible and dependent on the Parliament. Tax legislation, once it has been established, will remain in force for the long time. And there is no need to reintroduce, like in England, the legal basis for taxation each and every year. Parliament is seen as the decisive source of stately power and not as an obstacle to the exercise of stately power by the executive. Against this background, it's interesting to note that in the context of the German tradition, constitutional protection of the individual taxpayer has emerged as a fundamental element of the finely tuned balance between the individual and the state, while the same did not happen in the common law world, despite the fact that countries like the US have strong constitutional traditions of their own. In Germany, Parliament or the people have assumed the role of the monarch, and it is one of the basic features of Germany's constitution that citizens have to be protected against overreaching fiscal claims by the fundamental rights enshrined in the Grundgesetz, notwithstanding the fact that the people's representative is the source of fiscal legislation. And this also means that the application of the fundamental rights in the area of taxation is to a large extent meant to protect minorities against the interest of the majority, but also to protect the majority against powerful pressure groups among the rich and the mighty. In such a system like in Germany, but you could say the same of Switzerland, France, Italy, Spain, Brazil, the material principle of equality complements democratic decision-making. It fights tax privilege for the rich, as well as special charges on economic actors and events. It makes sure that majority decisions cannot go too far to the detriment of the outvoted minority. And it refutes particular claims by a powerful pressure group. This claim is to a certain extent supported by political economy. Voting works better as a means of collective decision-making if the principle of equality ensures that there is equal cost for everybody. Democracy works better than dictatorship as the majority taxes itself at the same rate as the minority, while the dictator doesn't tax himself. Given the amount of theoretical thinking and political argument that has been devoted to the interaction between taxation, democracy, and citizenship, one should assume that citizenship is a prominent element in designing tax laws around the world, in particular with respect to its international dimension. This line of thinking is corroborated by international customary law, which does not constrain a country's right to tax its own citizens wherever they live. Practical reality looks different. Citizenship has become largely irrelevant for international tax policy and has been replaced by concepts of residence and territoriality. To be more specific, under most income tax laws, only residents are subject to worldwide taxation, irrespective of their nationality, while non-residents are only taxable with respect to their income sourced in the taxing jurisdiction. As I said before, only the United States and Eritrea strictly adhere to worldwide taxability on the basis of nationality. Similar frameworks have emerged for other types of direct taxes. The first conclusion we can draw from this situation is that in the international situation, the notion of congruence or equivalence of the people who pay the tax, who vote on the tax, and who benefit from the tax does not hold. Citizens of a country might live abroad and are largely free of the tax, but still retain the right to vote. Vice versa, many people live in countries as resident aliens where they are subject to unlimited tax liability without having any say in the way revenue is raised and spent. The outcome is a mismatch between territorial and membership boundaries, as aptly described by Rainer Bauberg in the recent Oxford Handbook of Citizenship. So both the outbound and the inbound situation deserve a closer look. The first issue concerns out-of-country voting. Is it possible or even legitimate to link voting rights for citizens to taxability in the country of citizenship? This is not a problem for a country like the US. They tax their citizens wherever they are, and they grant them voting rights wherever they are. But countries which do not exercise their right to tax their expatriate citizens have to address the question of whether these expatriates should have voting rights or not. State practice varies hugely in this area. In a 2011 report, the Venice Commission of the European Union laid out that there is no uniform model in place. Many countries sustain voting rights without limitation, irrespective of residence, for example, France, Portugal, or Switzerland. Other countries award the franchise only to people living inside their home country, like Israel and Ireland. Most countries apply some middle-of-the-road concept. In Germany, voting rights typically expire 25 years after taking foreign residence, and the United Kingdom applies a similar statute of limitation of 15 years, as many British citizens learned the hard way when they were denied a vote in the Brexit referendum in June 2016. The most interesting feature of this problem lies in the fact that while the overall political momentum goes into the direction of generous admission of out-of-country voting, the courts have sustained constraints on expatriate voting all over the place. Neither the European Court of Human Rights nor the European Court of Justice have forced their member states to extend voting rights to citizens living abroad. And the same has been confirmed by domestic courts. It has been accepted that there must be some leeway for national legislators to decide when the link between a person and his home country has become so tenuous and weak that he or she is not sufficiently affected by and knowledgeable about the political decisions taken at home. The most recent and still pending cause célèbre in this field is a Canadian case currently pending with the Supreme Court of Canada on this country's elimination of expatriate voting rights. In 2015, in a judgment of the Court of Appeal for Ontario, the majority of judges rejected the view that this limitation infringes upon the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And the interesting reason why I quote this case is that the court in 2015, a Canadian court, goes directly back to Locke and Rousseau. I quote, "The electorate submits to the laws because it has had a voice in making them. This is the social contract that gives the laws its legitimacy. Permitting all non-resident citizens to vote would allow them to participate in making laws that affect Canadian residents on a daily basis but have little to no practical consequence for their own daily lives. This would erode the social contract and undermine the legitimacy of the laws. Adding a layer to citizenship, residence and physical presence can have an important influence on the rights and obligations of Canadians. Residents, whether citizens or not, pay the full array of taxes that support government programs." Be this as it may, the question remains whether it makes sense to enable those who do not pay the tax to decide on its levying and on its spending. One might even ask whether constitutional principles are infringed upon if foreign residents gain decisive votes in fiscal matters. Weighing the options, one has to accept the current state of the art. Also for resident citizens, voting rights do not depend anymore on their current financial contributions to the public coffers. We do not live in the 19th century. Moreover, in a representative democracy, elections are not only about taxing and spending, but affect many more long-term aspects of social, economic, and political life. A citizen resident abroad who doesn't pay tax on a current basis still has the right to return in the future and will be affected by other decisions taken by these institutions, and so far it makes sense to award out-of-country voting rights. But what's with the opposite situation? We have in the international tax order a lightheartedness which most countries apply when they tax foreign nationals who are resident within their jurisdictions. Unlike taxpayers living outside the jurisdictions, those resident aliens are not only liable to tax with their territorially sourced income and local assets, but with their worldwide income and net wealth. A New York lawyer who has been assigned to a German law firm for 2 years will find out that she has to pay tax in Germany not only on her income generated in Germany, but also on her income derived from sources in third countries, including her home jurisdictions. This is the state of the art in many countries, confirmed by a multitude of double taxation treaties. This leads us back to where we started out. Why are people obliged to pay tax? Assuming first that the state as such is justified and has to be funded, and assuming second that the state is entitled to exercise its jurisdictions over all persons and assets present in a territory, the foreigner will not have the right to reject the tax claim out of hand. But if it is correct that residents are basically obliged to pay no less tax than domestic citizens, why shouldn't they have a right to decide on how to raise and how to spend the tax? If one takes a wide view and subscribes to the thesis that voting rights should be in the hands of those individuals who are affected by the state's actions, it becomes obvious that foreign residents cannot be excluded easily. They contribute to the state's funds and they benefit from the state's public expenditure. It's interesting to learn how unlimited taxation of resident foreigners has developed during the 19th century, which focused on the states and citizenship. It was not self-evident to tax foreigners resident in your country at all, but that evolved at the beginning of the 20th century, in particular during the 1920s. And this, in the end, led to the question of whether foreign residents should have a say when it comes to voting. Again, the biggest problem is that when you vote, you do not only vote on your local tax at that current year, you vote on long-term developments which might not affect you in the future. And this brings us back to our original thesis that any lack in consent should be compensated for by content, which means that foreigners who are not allowed to vote on taxes but still have to pay the taxes just like a resident should be able to rely on the principle of equal treatment. This is not self-evident. In the 1920s, it was still the main position, also by German constitutional lawyers, that you can tax resident foreigners harder than you can tax your own citizens. That would not be supported today under the principle of equal treatment in most constitutions, and we have a whole array of international tax agreements in place which make sure that each foreign citizen is treated in exactly the same way as a resident citizen wherever they live. The international dimension, and I've got 5 minutes more, I think, the international dimension of taxation and democracy gains a completely different dynamic once we enter the field of tax competition. The model is easily explained. Mobile taxpayers and mobile production factors are able to move with ease between tax jurisdictions. This is particularly true for high skill or high net worth individuals and for financial and intangible capital, while low skill labor or land are rather immobile and stay put. According to the theory and to some extent to the reality of tax competition, This enables mobile persons and factors to exert pressure on local governments to provide a beneficial tax framework. Governments will not only feel obliged to recast their tax system and lower the tax burden on those mobile persons and factors, they will also reconsider the sheer size and the composition of the public sector, the efficiency of public spending and the scale of redistribution. This leads into Dani Roderick's famous globalization trilemma. Countries who want to participate in open markets for persons, goods, services, and capital will lose control of their domestic tax policy to a certain degree. This is viewed by many authors and political actors as a severe constraint on democratic decision-making. Mobile taxpayers gain factual influence on the political process, and its outcomes go far beyond their formal voting power. The economics of tax competition have been one of the mainstays of public finance research for several decades now, and shall not be reiterated in this lecture. One specific point of economic analysis which will not be discussed at length here concerns the borderline between so-called fair and unfair tax competition. We had a lot of work by the EU and the OECD on unfair tax competition, but still the situation is as follows. Countries are free to define their tax bases and their tax rates. They are in no way hampered to compete for outside investment, in particular by attracting real economic activity. This is the background for the recent announcements of far-reaching reductions in the corporate tax rates by the current governments of the United Kingdom and the United States. Such tax reductions will force those governments either to shrink the public sector or to increase other taxes or to take on additional public debt unless an upswing in the respective economy results in higher revenue by itself. But these moves by the United Kingdom and the announced move by the United States is in line with international standards of tax competition. So, what about the democratic process? I come back to the main thesis of my lecture, the mutual complementarity and interaction of consent-driven and content-driven constraints on taxation. Theorists of tax competition have long emphasized the fact that the option of a mobile taxpayer, corporate or individual, to move out of a tax jurisdictions can be modeled following Albert Hirschman's famous trinity of exit, voice, and loyalty. A taxpayer whose political preferences can be suppressed by majority rule and who is not constrained by strong loyalty to her country can use the exit route in order to escape adverse conditions in her home state, either by shifting her residence to another country or by moving her investment outside the jurisdiction. Learning from anecdotal evidence, it is fair to say that tax competition can fill a useful role in complementing protective devices such as consent and content. At the opposing end of the spectrum, we have to discuss to what extent material constraints prohibit a country's engagement in tax competition. This brings us into the world of tax preferences, in particular targeted tax breaks for foreign taxpayers or preferential treatment of specific items of income. Major examples concern ring-fenced tax regimes, which are only applicable to foreign investors, leaving the regular treatment of ordinary domestic taxpayers unchanged. Another example concerns distinction as to the type of income, like the German flat rate on interest and dividend income. Some economists go so far to say that at the end of history in taxation, the worldwide tax rate on capital income will be reduced to zero, while labor income will bear the full tax burden, either by way of direct taxation or by indirect taxation. The issues underlying these cases, namely whether the mechanics of tax competition, in particular the distinction between mobile and immobile factors, trump the principle of equality in fiscal matters. This leads us right into the heart of the conflict. From the perspective of European law, state aid discipline stands in the way of overly targeted tax breaks for specific groups of taxpayers. So a lot of preferential schemes had to be scrapped. But the general question of whether countries are allowed to introduce reduced tax rates, for example, for capital income as opposed to labor income, because capital is mobile and labor is not, stands out. One clear element of tax competition is the retransformation of a tax into a price for benefits received. In a similar vein as the contractarian political philosophers like Locke have conceived of the fiscal burden for the citizens of the state. In their world, taxpayers individually decided on their willingness to pay a price for the protection of their personal or business activities. From the perspective of the closed state and the closed economy, this contractarian view had been replaced in the 19th century by a state-oriented or community-oriented perspective, speaking not of equal benefit for the taxpayer, but of equal sacrifice in a solidaric community. Tax competition gives back to taxpayers the notion of consent in the Lockean sense, not by casting their vote in a universal ballot, but by deciding individually on where to take residence and to be employed, or where to invest and to carry on a business. This brings us to my last question, namely the question of whether the concept of solidarity has a meaning in this brave new tax world. Of course, people say multinational companies and other mobile taxpayers have to pay their fair share of tax, just as everyone else does. But if we want to make this claim operational, we face the necessity to identify and define the community to which these taxpayers belong and to which they owe solidarity in a moral sense. Looking back in history, it makes no sense to define the community based on citizenship. This is a concept that has lost its power and practical meaning for tax legislation 100 years ago. Today's tax legislation applies a territorial concept, looking to persons resident on a country and assets or activities located on a territory. But if this is the guiding light, each taxpayer can simply cut the ties of solidarity by moving out, moving to another jurisdiction where the tax environment is more attractive. Moreover, concepts of fairness and solidarity hardly tell us where in an international context taxes should be paid when two or more jurisdictions compete for the allocation of taxing rights. Under the auspices of tax competition, it's even harder to achieve the aim of redistribution. That has to be shifted to the highest possible level in order to make it operational. Dani Rodrik is right again. If you want to keep democracy intact, and if you want to keep political institutions in power, you have to shift these institutions to a higher level, possibly to a global level. This could be the start of another talk on the prospects of a world tax organization, or at least a strong framework for tax coordination, but I will leave that to another day. Thank you.